And when you look at just mapping out the coronavirus, I think the Financial Times does a really good job using the data here for the COVID tracking project to kind of highlight where the confirmed cases are. Given this is now 2 days old, so it's gone up, it hasn't crossed 34 million, so it's still fairly relevant. And we're starting to approach those million deaths. Again, depending on how much you believe China, I would say we're already over it. But again, we'll just go with the official statistics. And you can see that the US continues to climb. And then we have the increases in the UK, Spain, and France, which is weighing on kind of where the economy recovery on an aggregate global level will be. And then when we turn to China, to India, that's where we see a continuation in terms of a lack of diesel demand, gasoline demand. And that's something that's going to be problematic because it's not so much the stringency of the lockdown, it's how the consumer is being impacted even without government intervention. Now, when we look at the Oxford Index for Stringency, it's just how, what kind of lockdowns are being enforced, whether it's MTA, restaurants, in dining, just curbside pickup, different things. You can see how the stringency has been fairly consistent from, essentially March onward. We got 100% in a lot of places. And then once we came out and got into June, we've maintained this 50 to 75% intervention and averaging about 73%. But people themselves are naturally adjusting because they're trying to mitigate and avoid some of these hot spots, which again is going to just inherently weigh on just economic activity. This is impacting jobs. How many people are losing jobs? We've had Marathon announce another layoff round. We have airlines that have announced layoff rounds. We have Shell announcing. We have just a continuation in terms of new layoffs that continue to roll through, not just energy, but airlines, leisure. Just let's just be fair. I mean, there hasn't been a segment of the economy that hasn't been impacted, or an industry. And we'll break it down by industry in the second segment. And here's just one that we want to look at, talking about where things are in the US and the percentage of US population living with a increasing testing. So New York City is having a flashpoints where now we're above 5% positivity rate. Wyoming is something close to 26%. So again, it's not going to drive the government to take aggressive action because consumers are naturally adjusting their patterns of behavior to avoid some of these hotspots. And you can start to see some of this creep higher, which we would expect just given what happened in Europe when you had more in dining, you had schools going back. So none of this is really surprising. The bigger focus is going to be on when we may see people get more aggressive on the government side and consumers more aggressively at changing their tactics, will be hospitalizations and deaths. Deaths should be minimal given how we've adjusted treatment, but that infrastructure will be very important because we're seeing in France a big increase in one of their port cities in terms of just hospital infrastructure being stressed to the max. And again, those are things that will really impact, which I believe is the second largest city in France, Marseille, which is going to be problematic in terms of not only economic growth, but also how people are going to perceive, well, they're having some trouble, maybe we'll adjust a little bit more. So that could be a bigger headwind. And this is just driving home the factors that we've talked about when we look at just COVID disrupting business travel. So the international is essentially 95% down. Domestic is closer now to 75%. And that's something that we think is going to be a continuation, especially as the companies start to really hone in on, well, we have to be carbon neutral. And what's the easiest way to do it? Let's cut spending on travel, because not only are you cutting travel in airlines, you're cutting hotel stays, you're cutting rental cars. So these are things that you can say we're reducing that carbon footprint and putting a lot more of it online through webcams like we're doing right now, to be more pragmatic with the impacts and trying to hit not only fix the balance sheets, but also save the environment in their own way. Now, when we turn to the recovery tracker, specifically looking at the U.S., you can see that the cases continue to remain elevated, and we're continuing to shift higher. The new COVID deaths, again, we've been fairly consistent in terms of maintaining a comfortable level in terms of where we are. And obviously deaths never comfortable, but in terms of where we were in February and March, and where we are today is obviously vastly different. And then that lockdown index is continuing to sit there. The thing that we want to really look at is how is this impacting active oil rigs, oil, and then steel production and electricity. So we're starting to see additional price cuts. We're starting to see electricity demand start to dwindle. And again, there's a certain amount of different things where electricity demand obviously goes down because people aren't using AC as much, but this is supposed to be adjusted for seasonality. So we are starting to see a little bit more of a slowdown, especially on the industrial side. So this is something that we're going to keep looking at and keep tabs on as the impacts continue to go through and the overall economy. Now, when we start to look at the COVID impact on small businesses, we always like to keep tabs on, different providers of information. This one is LendingTree. We've seen different, and the reason why we look at different components is because we want to look at different consolidation of data from, because LendingTree may hit someone different than Indeed, may hit someone different than Yelp. So it's always looking at, what is that total impact? And here you can see decreased significantly in terms of the impact of gross revenue. Decreased significantly is 43%. So just consider just decrease slightly to decrease significantly. This is a huge component. I mean, this is almost, not to laugh, but it's almost 85% of small businesses have felt some significant impact. And the 43% are saying that there's a significant impact, which again comes down to hiring, spending. And this is the bigger component that we look at and get concerned about in terms of, well, how is this shifting the way people are consuming? And then when we look at the COVID consumption shift, this is an interesting backdrop in terms of what has happened. So when we look at U.S. household spending on durables versus services, so when we talk about PMIs, when we talk about ISM data, production data, industrial data, we're seeing essentially this bifurcation in the economy where durable goods and manufacturing have gotten some support, but services have dropped off considerably. And this is something where people who have delayed spending are now going out and spending on those durable goods, which again, we've seen an increase in imports. We've seen an increase in rail and trucking to get those durable goods to where they need to go. But services and things that you can cut fairly easy have dropped off considerably. And this, I think the spread kind of speaks for itself, where this is the widest it's been since the early 90s. And if you go back to this, I mean, first off, it's a new high compared to the 90s. And if you go back to the 60s, we've never seen this before in terms of the sheer size and scale, which is going to be a concern when you think of, because based on what the data we're seeing, the manufacturing is starting to slow a little bit. We got some decent data points today, which kind of says that things are still clicking along at a positive rate, but the services, we're just not seeing that come back around, which again is going to be problematic because what is the U.S. but a service-based economy? So that's going to be the problem when we consider what is the economy doing, what is the strength of the U.S. GDP, and then how does that migrate into the rest of the world, because we are the largest importer. And as we start to slow down, what are those imports going to do, which we'll talk about in the fourth segment. But on the next one, we're going to go a little bit deeper into U.S. data and specifically the economic data that has come out over the last week and a half.